I'm 16, forced into birth control, haven't had a checkup in 4 years, and my dad still feeds me fast food, even though my kidney doctor told him not to. What are my legal rights? I was born small, a pound and a handful of ounces, like life wasn't sure if it wanted me here. The nurses told my grandma later that I was a fighter, but no one tells you what happens when the fight never really stops. When I was a baby, the machines breathed for me. When I grew older, it was pills and doctor visits, always something attached to keep me going. I don't remember my mother, but people say she was gentle. They also say her heart just stopped. 2 months after I came into the world, she left it. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I wonder if her heart gave out because it was tired of fighting too. My grandma raised me after that. Her kitchen smelled like real food. Soups, rice, herbs, things she said would keep the bad pressure down. She didn't have much, but she had care. She'd check my blood pressure every Sunday morning, and when the numbers were good, she'd smile like I'd just graduated from something. When she died, everything in me hollowed out. I was 12, old enough to understand what death meant, but too young to understand what it does to the people who are left. My dad took over after that, though took over might not be the right phrase. It's like someone hit pause on the part of him that was supposed to know how to be a parent. He didn't cook, didn't clean much. The fridge slowly turned into a science experiment. Leftovers that grew fuzz, bottles of soda stacked beside my blood pressure meds. Dinner turned into paper bags, greasy, salty, heavy. Fast food every night, the kind that tasted good for 5 minutes and made me feel sick for hours. My kidney doctor told him to stop, said it was undoing everything my medication was trying to fix. Dad nodded each time, promised he'd start cooking soon, but soon became years. Most nights, my brother would scroll through DoorDash, tapping his favorites, McDonald's, Chick-fil-A. If I said I wanted something healthier, he'd roll his eyes. Then we're not ordering anything, he'd say. And my stomach would twist, not just from hunger, but from knowing that arguing meant not eating at all. That's how control works in my family. Silent, invisible, and always in someone else's hands. The house never smelled like food anymore, just oil, grease, and mold. I'd stand in front of the fridge sometimes, staring at the expired containers, trying to convince myself to go buy something healthy. But I couldn't, because no one else did. And if I brought home fruit or salad, they'd laugh. You think you're better than us? I was 16 and already tired of pretending that normal meant surviving. I hadn't had a real checkup since my grandma died. No dentist, no wellness exams, only my nephrologist, the one doctor who still remembered me from when I was little. Even he noticed how I'd changed. You look pale, he'd said once. Are you eating enough? I lied. Of course I did. Then came my aunt. She's the kind of woman who talks like she's saving you but never listens. One day she said, "You're 16 now. You need to see a gynecologist." I didn't question it. I didn't question much by then. I just went where I was told. When the doctor asked me why I was there, I said, "I don't know." It was true. My dad never explained. My aunt never explained. The doctor blinked like she didn't know what to do with that answer. Then she and my aunt started talking about me, not to me. They mentioned birth control. I remember feeling confused. I told them I didn't need it, that I wasn't having sex. They smiled that condescending adult smile, the kind that says you don't know what's good for you. They decided on something called Nexplanon. I didn't even know what that was. When my aunt asked why I didn't want it, I said, "Because I don't do stuff like that." She said, "Just because you're not active now doesn't mean you won't be later." That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. A few months later, she told me, "Your dad made the appointment." I remember that sentence because it didn't sound real. Your dad made the appointment, like it was something to be proud of, like he was finally stepping up, except it was for the one thing I didn't want. The day he picked me up from school, he said nothing, just told me we had a doctor's appointment. I asked if it was nephrology. He ignored me. The car ride was silent except for the hum of the AC. My hands were sweating. My chest felt tight. Something about the way he wouldn't meet my eyes told me this wasn't just another appointment. When we got there, I saw the same doctor from before. My aunt was waiting. My stomach dropped. That's when I knew. I asked what was happening, but no one answered. The nurse led me into a room that smelled like antiseptic and latex. I started shaking. The doctor looked annoyed. "Why are you nervous?" she asked. I said, "Because I don't want this." She sighed like I was being difficult. She called my dad on speakerphone. "She's refusing the procedure," she said. There was a pause, and then his voice, cold and flat. "She doesn't have a choice." The words echoed in my head like a slap. That's when I started crying, and no one stopped. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like and tell me in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? I still remember the sound of the paper under me, that sterile crinkle as I shifted on the exam table, trying to make myself smaller. My palms were wet. My throat felt like it was closing. The nurse told me to relax. But how do you relax when you're about to be violated by people who say they love you? The doctor rolled her chair closer. She was calm, too calm, like she'd done this 100 times, and my tears were just another inconvenience on her schedule. I told her again, "I don't want this." My voice cracked mid-sentence, barely louder than a whisper. She didn't even look up from the tray. Metal instruments clinked softly against each other, that sound slicing through the silence. When she called my dad, I thought maybe he'd change his mind. Maybe hearing me cry would remind him that I was his daughter. Not a patient, not a problem to fix, but his kid. But then his voice came through the phone, flat, detached. "She doesn't have a choice." That broke something in me. The nurse took my hand. She said, "It'll be quick." But quick doesn't mean painless. It doesn't mean right. I kept shaking my head, crying so hard I could barely breathe. I begged them to stop. I told them I didn't consent. The doctor's gloves brushed my arm, cold, rubbery, and I jerked away. away. She looked at me like I was overreacting, like I was a child throwing a tantrum. Then she said something I'll never forget. "You'll thank us later." I didn't thank her. I screamed inside. I tried to make myself pass out. I held my breath. My vision blurred, my ears rang, but my body wouldn't shut down the way I wanted it to. I could feel everything. The sting, the pressure, the sound of my heartbeat crashing against my ribs. Tears kept running down my face, hot and endless. The nurse whispered, "You're doing great," but she looked away, like she couldn't bear to see what was happening. When it was done, the doctor taped a piece of gauze over my arm like she'd fixed something instead of breaking me. I sat there in silence, staring at the white walls, wishing they would swallow me whole. My aunt laughed awkwardly. "See, that wasn't so bad." Bad? It was worse than bad. It was betrayal. It was being trapped in my own body while everyone else decided what to do with it. On the ride home, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, suffocating. My dad drove like it was just another errand checked off his list. I kept my arm pressed against my stomach, afraid to touch the spot where they'd forced the implant in. When we got home, he dropped me off at the door and went straight to his room. No hug, no explanation, just a door closing behind him. I sat on the couch staring at my bandaged arm. I wanted to rip it out myself, dig my nails into my skin until it was gone, but I didn't. I just cried until I couldn't anymore. That night, I dreamt I was back in that room. Only this time, there were no voices, just bright lights and that same cold hand pressing against my arm. I woke up gasping. My sheets were damp with sweat, my heart racing so hard it hurt. Days turned into weeks, and I started feeling different, not just physically, but inside. I was scared of mirrors, scared of my own reflection. It didn't feel like my body anymore. It felt borrowed, controlled. My anxiety, which had always been bad, started to spiral. Every ache, every flutter in my chest felt like proof something was wrong. I'd Google symptoms until 2 a.m., convincing myself I was dying. And through it all, my dad acted like nothing happened. He'd call from the other room, "You hungry?" And when I didn't answer, he'd order Chick-fil-A anyway. Like food could patch what he'd done. I stopped eating much. My clothes started hanging off me. 97 pounds turned into 90. Then 87, he didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care to. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the silence. No one talked about it. Not once. Not him, not my aunt. It was like they'd erased the memory from their heads while it replayed in mine every single night. Sometimes I'd hold my arm and whisper, you're okay, just to hear someone say it. But I wasn't okay. I was angry. Angry that my choices didn't matter. Angry that my voice meant nothing. Angry that my own blood, my family, thought control was the same as care. One day, I caught a glimpse of myself in the bathroom mirror. My eyes looked older, harder, like the part of me that still believed in love had burned out quietly while no one noticed. That's when I realized they could force my body, but they couldn't own my story. I started writing everything down, every word, every detail of that day. Not because I wanted to remember, but because I refused to let them forget. I didn't know it yet, but that notebook would become the start of something bigger, the beginning of my fight to take my life back. For now, though, I was still that 16-year-old girl, sitting in a quiet house that smelled like old grease, clutching her notebook like a weapon and whispering to herself in the dark. They said it was for my safety, but I've never felt more unsafe in my life. The days after that were a blur, like time was moving, but I wasn't. I'd sit by my window and watch cars pass, wondering how so many people could just live, how they could smile or laugh or drive to the grocery store without feeling like the world was pressing down on their chest. I couldn't even step outside without feeling that phantom ache in my arm, a constant reminder that something inside me didn't belong there. My friends stopped texting, not because they didn't care, but because I stopped answering. What could I even say? Hey, sorry I've been distant. My dad forced a birth control implant into my arm. It didn't sound real. It sounded like a nightmare someone made up to scare you. So I stayed quiet. Until one night, around 2 a.m., I found myself scrolling through Reddit. I don't even remember what I typed at first. Something like, doctor forced implant against my will, or no consent medical procedure teen. The results flooded in. Posts from other people who'd been dismissed, ignored, silenced. Women who had begged to be heard and weren't. For the first time, I didn't feel crazy. For the first time, I realized what happened to me wasn't for my own good. It was illegal. There it was, in black and white. A medical procedure performed without informed consent is assault. My hands were shaking. I kept reading, diving deeper into every comment thread, every story. People mentioned mandatory reporting, CPS, medical consent laws. My heart started racing with something I hadn't felt in months, hope. The next morning, I called the clinic. My voice trembled, but I tried to sound calm. I need my medical records from last month, I said. The receptionist hesitated. Name? I gave it. There was a pause. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. Oh, that procedure was authorized by your father. We can't release those records to you without parental consent. Parental consent. The irony nearly made me laugh. I didn't need consent to have something shoved inside my body, but I needed consent to see the paperwork about it. I hung up before I started crying again. That night, I pulled out the notebook. I wrote down everything. Every date, every word, every detail. My dad's phone call, the doctor's expression, the nurse's voice. I wrote it like evidence, not emotion, because maybe that's what it was now. Evidence. Over the next few days, I reached out to an online women's rights subreddit. I didn't give my real name, just Jay. I posted my story, shaking as I hit submit. It got hundreds of comments. People were furious, outraged. Some shared resources, legal aid links, helplines, organizations that helped minors in medical abuse cases. Others just said, I believe you. Those 3 words broke me more than anything. I believe you. I hadn't heard them once from the people who were supposed to love me most. Someone messaged me privately, a woman named Lara. She said she worked with a nonprofit that helped teens like me. At first, I didn't trust her. I didn't trust anyone, but she never pushed. She just listened. And then one night, she said something that changed everything. You have a right to your own body, Jay. You have a right to your medical records. You have a right to be safe. The next morning, I called again, this time with Lara on the other line, muted but listening. I asked for my records once more. When they tried the same excuse, parental consent, Lara jumped in. This is a violation of HIPAA and state medical consent laws, she said calmly. If you deny her access again, you'll be hearing from our legal department. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. A few days later, an envelope came in the mail. My hands shook as I tore it open. Inside were copies of the forms, one with my dad's signature, one blank where mine should have been. No initials, no consent box checked, nothing. I stared at it for a long time, not crying, not shaking, just still, because that paper was proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that they'd violated me. Proof that every scream, every tear, every sleepless night, it all meant something now. I sent the copies to Lara. She told me she'd forward them to a legal advocate. She warned me that it might take time, that it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, the idea of hard didn't scare me, because at least now, it was my fight. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I sat by the window, watching the rain hit the glass, and whispered to myself, they took my choice, but they didn't take my voice. For the first time in months, I slept through the night, and somewhere deep inside, beneath all the fear and anger, I felt the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt since before that day. Power. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The morning after I mailed my records, I felt different. Not lighter exactly, but sharper. Like I was finally holding a piece of myself that had been stolen. The weight in my chest was still there, but now it felt less like despair and more like determination. I found myself standing in front of my dad's bedroom door. It was early, and the sun hadn't fully burned off the Texas fog. I didn't know why I was knocking. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was anger. Probably both. He opened the door, rubbing sleep from his eyes. What? I swallowed. My throat was tight, my hands trembling, but my voice came out steady. We need to talk about everything, he frowned. Everything? Yes, about the appointment, about the implant, about me. He looked at me like I had grown a second head. Jay, I don't know what you're talking about. I felt a spark in my chest. Not the spark of fear this time, but of fire. Don't lie to me. Don't act like what you did was okay. You forced me, against my will. And it's not just wrong. It's illegal. His eyes narrowed. Illegal? Come on, it's not like that. I'm your dad. I make decisions for you. You don't get to make decisions that violate my body, I said, my voice rising. For the first time, I could feel every ounce of rage that had been simmering for months. You think you're protecting me. You think it's care. It's not. It's control. And I'm done letting you control me. He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. I have proof. The clinic didn't get my consent. I have every form, every record. I've sent them to someone who will make sure this stops. He stepped back, stunned. I could see that he hadn't expected this. Maybe he thought I'd cry, beg, retreat. Maybe he thought fear would silence me forever. But I wasn't scared anymore. Not really. I want you to know, I continued, my voice quieter now but stronger, that this changes everything. I'm not the kid you can decide for anymore. I'm done pretending that your version of care is enough. He swallowed hard. There was a long silence. I could feel the tension thick in the air. It was like holding my breath underwater, waiting for an answer I didn't want to hear but had to. Finally, he muttered, I didn't think you'd fight back. Then maybe it's time you start thinking, I said. After that, things shifted. Not immediately, but I could feel the subtle change. He didn't argue as much. He didn't laugh off my questions. He started listening in his own awkward way. I still couldn't say I trusted him completely, but for the first time, he wasn't a wall I couldn't climb over. Meanwhile, my legal advocate began contacting the clinic. Emails, phone calls, threats of formal investigation. I felt a mixture of anxiety and relief. Anxiety because I knew how ugly family conflicts could get when the law got involved. Relief because I finally had someone on my side. Someone outside the family. Someone who didn't dismiss my voice. Weeks went by. The rainstorms passed, the AC buzzed in the background, and I sat in my room writing, planning, and remembering every detail of that day. I felt myself growing stronger with every line I wrote. The fear that had lived in my bones for months began to crumble, replaced by something like purpose. Then came the call. The kind you don't forget. Jay, this is Lara, the voice said. Calm, professional, certain. The clinic has admitted that there was a violation. They're cooperating with our investigation. We're moving forward with legal action. I hung up and just stared at the wall. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. From relief. From the weight of finally being seen. Finally being heard. That night, I walked through the house like I owned it. I touched my arm, the site of all my pain, and I didn't feel violated. I felt reclaimed. It didn't fix the fear, the nightmares, or the scars, but it was the first step toward healing. And somewhere deep inside, I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself before. My family could take my childhood, my trust even try to take control of my body, but they could never take my voice if I refused to give it up. For the first time, I started to believe I could fight back, not just survive, but win. The weeks that followed felt surreal, like living inside a storm while watching the clouds slowly break apart. My dad was quieter, more careful with his words, though still defensive at times. My brother seemed to sense the tension, but didn't fully understand it. I didn't explain. I couldn't. Some battles are yours alone. Lara kept me updated daily. Every call from her was like a tether to reality, a reminder that I wasn't alone anymore. She told me the clinic was being investigated for procedural violations, and the doctor who had performed the implant without my consent was under review. It was happening. The system I'd thought powerless was finally turning in my favor. One evening, I sat on my bed with the notebook open. I was adding notes from the calls, from the legal guidance, from the emotions I hadn't allowed myself to feel yet. I wrote about anger, about betrayal, about the heavy quiet in my house. I wrote about fear, but also about determination. I realized that writing wasn't just a record. It was a shield. It reminded me that I was still in control of something. My story, my voice. My dad tried to speak that night. He came into my room cautiously, like approaching a wild animal. Cheese about all this. I didn't mean. I held up a hand. Don't, just listen. He nodded, sitting on the edge of my bed. For a moment, he looked smaller, less like the authority figure who had forced me, and more like a man realizing he'd broken something he could never fully fix. I wanted to protect you, he said softly. Protect me? I laughed bitterly. You don't get to protect me by taking away my choices. That's control, not care. He was silent. I could see the shame curling around him like smoke. He didn't apologize fully, but it was the closest he'd come. The next few days were tense. I went to school, keeping my head down, trying to act normal, but inside I felt a fire burning. At home, meals were still fast food, but I started buying my own groceries. Salads, fruits, protein bars. I cooked simple things in the microwave, but every bite felt like a small victory. One afternoon, Lara called. They've scheduled a formal hearing with the clinic and the doctor, she said. This is serious. They could face fines, revocation of license. They're taking it very seriously. My heart raced. Finally, justice wasn't just a word I whispered in the dark. It was happening. I started imagining what life would look like after. The implant could be removed if I wanted, and my advocate would make sure the procedure was covered legally. I could finally decide what happened with my own body. The thought alone made my chest ache, but in a good way, like breathing fresh air after being trapped underwater for years. At school, I began noticing things I hadn't before. The way friends laughed freely, the way teachers listened, the way ordinary life went on. I realized I'd been surviving for so long that I forgot life could feel normal. Then came the first official meeting. I was nervous, my palms sweaty, but I walked in like I belonged there. For the first time, I wasn't a passive participant in my own story. I spoke clearly, recounting the events, the phone calls, the lack of consent. The investigators listened. They asked questions. They took notes. When it was over, I stepped outside and felt the sun on my face. For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of safety, not just physical, but emotional. At home, my dad was waiting, silent. I didn't know what he was thinking, and I didn't care. The battle wasn't about forgiveness yet. It was about reclaiming my life. I started planning small steps toward independence, getting my driver's license, saving for a car, even looking into part-time jobs. Each decision, each plan, was a brick in the wall I was building between my autonomy and the control my family had tried to exert over me. At night, I'd hold my arm, the scar, the memory, and I didn't feel violated anymore. I felt aware, vigilant, prepared. I wrote in my notebook, they took my choice, but they can't take my voice, and they can't take what I do with it. And slowly, something inside me shifted from fear to power. Not reckless power, not revenge, but the quiet, steady kind that grows when you've been underestimated for too long. I knew the road ahead would be hard. The legal process would be slow. My dad might never fully understand. But for the first time, I wasn't waiting for permission. I was taking action. Somewhere deep inside, I realized that survival was no longer enough. I was going to thrive, and I would make sure the world knew my story. The morning of the hearing, I woke up early. My stomach was a knot of nerves and anticipation. For years, I'd felt powerless, invisible, unheard. Today, I was about to be seen, not as a scared 16-year-old, but as a person whose voice mattered. Lara drove me to the courthouse. The streets of Texas were quiet, the sunlight soft and golden, but my heart felt like it was hammering against my ribs. I gripped the notebook in my lap, the pages filled with my story, my truth, my evidence. It was more than words, it was armor. Inside the room, the clinic representatives and the doctor were there, faces carefully neutral, but I could see the tension under their composed exteriors. The investigators introduced themselves, explaining the process. I listened, and then it was my turn. I took a deep breath. I spoke slowly, deliberately, recounting the day they forced the implant, my father's call, the laughter of the doctor and my aunt. I spoke about my fear, my sleepless nights, my weight loss, the anxiety that had consumed me. Every detail mattered. Every word mattered. I noticed the doctor shifting in her seat, the clinic staff whispering to each other. They hadn't expected me to be prepared. They hadn't expected me to fight. When I finished, the room was silent. Then came questions from the investigators. I answered truthfully, calmly, though my hands shook. Each answer was a reclamation, a step back to ownership of my body, my story, my life. By the end of the session, the investigators assured me that there would be consequences. The clinic faced sanctions. The doctor was under review and could lose her license. The implant could be legally removed if I wanted it. Finally, justice was moving forward. Walking out of that building, the Texas sun hit my face. It wasn't just light. It was a signal, a reminder that I had survived the darkness and was stepping into something new. When I got home, I found my dad in the kitchen. He looked older, smaller, weighed down by the reality of his choices. I didn't speak at first. I just watched him. For the first time, I saw the man behind the authority, the man who had made decisions without understanding the consequences. He began, but I shook my head. Save it, I said. Not with anger, but with clarity. You need to understand that this isn't just about rules. It's about respect, and I'm taking mine back. He didn't respond. I didn't need him to. I needed to respond to myself. Over the next weeks, I worked on rebuilding my life. I started cooking small meals for myself, finally getting nutrients I hadn't had in years. I started driver's ed, saving up for a car. Every step was small, but each one was mine. No one forced me. No one controlled me. I decided. My nightmares didn't disappear overnight, but they became easier to manage. I journaled, I wrote, I spoke with therapists. The implant remained, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a memory of survival, a reminder that I had endured, and that endurance could transform into power. I began sharing parts of my story online, anonymously at first, then with my voice. People responded with messages of support, outrage, solidarity. They told me I was brave, that I had inspired them. I realized something profound. My pain had a purpose beyond me. My voice could protect others, could shine light on injustices that too often went unseen. One evening, I sat by the window, notebook open, writing my final thoughts on the experience. The rain tapped softly against the glass. I paused, thinking about the journey, the fear, the tears, the helplessness, the betrayal. And then I thought about the fight, the legal advocacy, the reclaiming of my voice, and the strength that had grown in the cracks of that brokenness. I wrote, they said it was for my safety, but I've never felt more unsafe in my life. Yet in that darkness, I found my voice. They took my choice, but they could never take my story. And now, my story is mine to tell. I closed the notebook and looked at my reflection in the window. The girl staring back at me was smaller than the world had tried to make her feel, but stronger, fierce in ways I hadn't known existed. She had survived violation, betrayal, neglect, and had turned it into power. Justice wasn't perfect. My father still had to live with his choices. The clinic still operated, but under watchful eyes. The doctor still practiced medicine, but her reputation was tarnished. And me? I had something far greater. Control over my body, my decisions, my life. For the first time in years, I felt safe, not because anyone else ensured it, but because I had fought for it. And in that quiet, rainy Texas evening, I finally whispered to myself the words I had needed for so long. I am not a victim. I am a survivor, and I am free. The storm had passed. And on the other side, I found my own light,